Etymology: New Zealand place names. The first European visitor to New Zealand, Dutch explorer Abel Tasman, named the island Staten Land, believing they were part of the Staten Land that Jacob Lemaire had sighted off the southern end of South America. Hendrik Brouwer proved that the South American land was a small island in 1643, and Dutch cartographers subsequently renamed Tasman's discovery Nova Zealandia from Latin, after the Dutch province of Zealand. This name was later anglicized to New Zealand. This was written as New Tarini in the Maori language. In 1834, a document written in Maori and entitled Hiwakapyatanga o Tirangapiratanga o New Tarini was translated into English and became the Declaration of the Independence of New Zealand. It was prepared by T.W.H. Akamanenga Onga Rangapiratanga Onga Hapu o New Tarini, the United Tribes of New Zealand, and a copy was sent to King William IV, who had already acknowledged the flag of the United Tribes of New Zealand, and who recognized the declaration in a letter from Lord Glenelg. Aotearoa, pronounced A-T-A-A in Maori and slash A-T Ro slash in English, often translated as Land of the Long White Cloud, is the current Maori name for New Zealand. It is unknown whether Maori had a name for the whole country before the arrival of Europeans. Aotearoa originally referred to just the North Island. Maori had several traditional names for the two main islands, including Tika a Maui, the fish of Maui, for the North Island, and Tiwe Paunamu, the waters of Greenstone, or Tiwaka o Aoraki, the canoe of Aoraki, for the South Island. Early European maps labeled the islands North Island, Middle, South Island, and South, Stewart Island/Rikiura. In 1830, mapmakers began to use North and South on their maps to distinguish the two largest islands, and by 1907 this was the accepted norm. The New Zealand Geographic Board discovered in 2009 that the names of the North Island and South Island had never been formalized, and names and alternative names were formalized in 2013. This set the names as North Island or Tika a Maui and South Island or Tiwe Paunamu. For each island, either its English or Maori name can be used, or both can be used together. Similarly, the Maori and English names for the whole country are sometimes used together. Aotearoa, New Zealand, however, this has no official recognition. History of New Zealand. For a chronological guide, see Timeline of New Zealand history. One set of arrows point from Taiwan to Melanesia to Fiji/Samoa, and then to the Marquesas Islands. The population then spread, some going south to New Zealand and others going north to Hawaii. A second set start in southern Asia and end in Melanesia. The Maori people descend from Polynesians whose ancestors emigrated from Taiwan to Melanesia between 3000 and 1000 BCE, and then traveled east, reaching the Society Islands c. 1000 CE. After a pause of 200 to 300 years, a new wave of exploration led to the discovery and settlement of New Zealand. New Zealand is one of the last major landmasses settled by humans. Radiocarbon dating, evidence of deforestation and mitochondrial DNA variability within Maori populations, suggests that Eastern Polynesians first settled the New Zealand archipelago between 1250 and 1300, although newer archaeological and genetic research points to a date no earlier than about 1280, with at least the main settlement period between about 1320 and 1350. Consistent with evidence, based on genealogical traditions. This represented a culmination in a long series of voyages through the Pacific Islands. Over the centuries that followed, the Polynesian settlers developed a distinct culture now known as Maori. The population formed different iwi tribes and hapu sub-tribes, which would sometimes cooperate, sometimes compete, and sometimes fight against each other. At some point, a group of Maori migrated to Rakayu, now known as the Chatham Islands, where they developed their distinct Moriori culture. The Moriori population was all but wiped out between 1835 and 1862 in the Moriori genocide, largely because of Taranaki Maori invasion and enslavement in the 1830s, although European diseases also contributed. In 1862, only 101 survived, and the last known full-blooded Moriori died in 1933. An engraving of a sketched coastline on white background map of the New Zealand coastline as Cook charted it on his first visit in 1769-70. The track of the Endeavour is also shown. In a hostile 1642 encounter between Gadi Tumatakakiri and Dutch explorer Abel Tasman's crew, 4 of Tasman's crew members were killed, and at least 1 Maori was hit by canister shot. Europeans did not revisit New Zealand until 1769, when British explorer James Cook mapped almost the entire coastline. Following Cook, New Zealand was visited by numerous European and North American whaling, sealing, and trading ships. They traded European food, metal tools, weapons, and other goods for timber, Maori food, artifacts, and water. The introduction of the potato and the musket transformed Maori agriculture and warfare. Potatoes provided a reliable food surplus, which enabled longer and more sustained military campaigns. The resulting intertribal musket wars encompassed over 600 battles between 1801 and 1840, killing 40,000 Maori. From the early 19th century, Christian missionaries began to settle New Zealand, eventually converting most of the Maori population. The Maori population declined to around 40% of its pre-contact level during the 19th century. Introduced diseases were the major factor. A torn sheet of paper, the Waitangi sheet. From the Treaty of Waitangi, the British government appointed James Busby as British resident to New Zealand in 1832 following a petition from Northern Maori. His duties were to protect British commerce, mediate between the unruly Pukeha, European settlers and Maori, and to apprehend escaped convicts. In 1835, following an announcement of impending French settlement by Charles de Thierry, the nebulous United Tribes of New Zealand sent a declaration of independence to King William IV of the United Kingdom, asking for protection. Ongoing unrest, the proposed settlement of New Zealand by the New Zealand Company, which had already sent its first ship of surveyors to buy land from Maori, and the dubious legal standing of the Declaration of Independence, prompted the Colonial Office to send Captain William Hobson to claim sovereignty for the United Kingdom and negotiate a treaty with the Maori. The Treaty of Waitangi was first signed in the Bay of Islands on 6 February 1840. In response to the New Zealand Company's attempts to establish an independent settlement in Wellington and French settlers purchasing land in Akaroa, Hobson declared British sovereignty over all of New Zealand on 21 May 1840, even though copies of the treaty were still circulating throughout the country for Maori to sign. With the signing of the Treaty and Declaration of Sovereignty, the number of immigrants, particularly from the United Kingdom, began to increase. New Zealand was administered as part of the colony of New South Wales until becoming a separate Crown colony, the colony of New Zealand, on 3 May 1841. Armed conflict began between the colonial government and Maori in 1843, with Werao afraid over land and disagreements over sovereignty. These conflicts, mainly in the North Island, saw thousands of Imperial troops and the Royal Navy come to New Zealand and became known as the New Zealand Wars. Following these armed conflicts, large amounts of Maori land was confiscated by the government to meet settler demands. Black and white engraving depicting a crowd of people a meeting of European and Maori inhabitants of Hawke's Bay Province. Engraving, 1863. The colony gained a representative government in 1852, and the first parliament met in 1854. In 1856 the colony effectively became self-governing, gaining responsibility over all domestic matters except native policy, which was granted in the mid-1860s. Following concerns that the South Island might form a separate colony, Premier Alfred Donat moved a resolution to transfer the capital from Auckland to a locality near Cook Strait. Wellington was chosen for its central location, with Parliament officially sitting there for the first time in 1865. In 1886, New Zealand annexed the volcanic Kermadec Islands, about 1,000 kilometers (620 miles) northeast of Auckland. Since 1937, the islands are uninhabited except for about 6 people at Raoul Island Station. These islands put the northern border of New Zealand at 29 degrees south latitude. In 1891 the Liberal Party came to power as the first organized political party. The Liberal government, led by Richard Seddon, for most of its period in office, 68, passed many important social and economic measures. In 1893 New Zealand was the first nation in the world to grant all women the right to vote, and in 1894 pioneered the adoption of compulsory arbitration between employers and unions. In 1907, at the request of the New Zealand Parliament, King Edward VII proclaimed New Zealand a dominion within the British Empire, reflecting its self-governing status. In 1947 the country adopted the Statute of Westminster, confirming that the British Parliament could no longer legislate for New Zealand without the consent of New Zealand. Early in the 20th century, New Zealand was involved in world affairs, fighting in the First and Second World Wars and suffering through the Great Depression. The Depression led to the election of the first Labour government and the establishment of a comprehensive welfare state and a protectionist economy. New Zealand experienced increasing prosperity following the Second World War, and Maori began to leave their traditional rural life and move to the cities in search of work. A Maori protest movement developed, which criticized Eurocentrism and worked for greater recognition of Maori culture and of the Treaty of Waitangi. In 1975, a Waitangi tribunal was set up to investigate alleged breaches of the treaty, and it was enabled to investigate